Welcome. I am Melissa Courtney. I am the Development Director here at Bridge Over Troubled Waters, and we're really glad that you can join us today for Youth-Centric and Trauma-Informed, the third in our three-part educational series for National Homeless Youth Awareness Month. If you've missed the first two, we do have the first recording of Mental Health Matters up on our website right now. You can also access it at www.bridgeotw.org/mental health matters. And the recording for our second event, which was last week about building community, is going to be up very shortly after the holiday. But again, thank you for those that can join us today. I'm really excited to introduce our speakers, Rachel Ellingson and Courtney Gibeley. I hope I'm saying those last names correctly. I should have asked you, but I'll let you introduce yourselves for that. So welcome, Rachel, welcome, Courtney. Thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And thank you for having us. I think this is a really important conversation to have, and I'm excited to talk about it. So my name is Rachel. I am the Clinical Supervisor here at Bridge Over Troubled Waters. Essentially what that means is I am clinically overseeing all of our programs and the direct care staff to provide support and coaching and supervision, just to make sure that we are approaching our youth with a trauma-informed lens and making safe spaces for them. So I'm excited to talk about those things today. And then Courtney is our emergency residence clinician. I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thank you, Melissa. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Courtney Gibeley. I work in the emergency residence as the residential clinician here. So the emergency residence is a 6-month-long program for youth experiencing homelessness. I meet with them once a week to help with clinical case management, and that's kind of my main role here.
Great, and thank you both for joining us today. And I should let everyone who is joining us live that this is being recorded, but it's only recording the speakers. And so no participants will be recorded except unless you ask a question verbally at the end. And just to give a sense of where we'll start and where we'll head up by the end of the event is we're going to start with a conversation between, well, I'll be a little bit involved, but mostly between Courtney and Rachel as we discuss today's topic. And toward the end of the half an hour that we have together, we will certainly open it up for questions. If you'd like to chat a question at any time, please do that. And we can either answer it in the moment or save it for the end. And, certainly if you'd like to ask a question verbally, please just raise your hand at the end. But again, thank you for joining us today. So Courtney and Rachel, part of when we're discussing this event and discussing what we really, I'll step back up, taking the context of National Homeless Youth Awareness Month and, this education series, part of what we really wanted to do was also look at common misconceptions about youth who are experiencing homelessness, who our youth might be, but also the reasons for becoming homeless. And there are certain myths out there that I think many of us have heard. And I'd like to start there today with, raising this awareness of what are myths that you have heard about youth and what are the realities that you see on a daily basis that debunk those myths that we might know.
Yeah, I can start on that. So I think common misconceptions about youth experiencing homelessness is, I've heard a variety from anywhere that it's they're lazy to it's all substance use to they're criminal or court involved. I think oftentimes there's like this conception of having some sort of hygiene issue, but in reality, it's really a matter of lack of resources and support. And so on my floor specifically, a lot of my youth come from abusive families or families where they weren't accepted because of parts of their identity. Some of them do have some substance use that they're trying to work through, but that's often a result of like an intergenerational trauma or violence or systems of oppression. Yeah, I think also there's a lot of mental illness, that our youth experience, and that makes it very difficult for them to be successful without supports.
Absolutely. I would agree with a lot of that. I think like many of the common misconceptions are around like, oh, productivity, like, well, they didn't want to go to college or they didn't want better for themselves, when really it's what they had access to. And many of the youth that come in our doors, like you wouldn't tell them apart on the street from the youth that are like just on the other side of the common going to Emerson. I mean, these are young people who are just trying to live the same way that anybody else is. I mean, the mental illness particularly is something that we see quite a bit. And I think that comes from backgrounds of trauma, family rejection, or lack of access to resources. And so the trauma that they have accumulated over their very short lives, like leads them to a point where like maybe they don't have the resources to go to college or to seek out employment that is in alignment with their goals. Or maybe it's too stressful, even just getting through the day, to think about that next step. So I think youth homelessness or youth who are experiencing homelessness are really in a place where they're in survival mode. So, they're approaching things one day at a time and are just trying to get their basic needs met.
You both mentioned a lack of resources. Can you be a little bit more specific for what those resources might be?
Yeah, I think this is pretty much a range from familial resources to treatment support. I have youth that come on my floor that don't know how to start the dishwasher, or they don't know. I'm trying to think of other examples, but certain social cues that we try to walk them through, versus also they don't have access to healthcare. We need to get them insurance in order for them to get the treatment that they need to help with their mental illness. So I think it really stems from anywhere between resources for life skills to education to services.
And just to add on to that, I would say the mental health resources as well. I think, the school systems that they've been through leading up to their adulthood are not always equipped to provide them with the counseling they need to identify, like, what do I want for my future, or who am I really, and what does that mean in the context of what I bring to the world, and so I think they come to Bridge and are really in a place where they're sometimes lost, and also sometimes they're not at all. They know exactly what they want, but they don't have the finances, or they don't have a mentor or someone to show them the way.
I think for National Homeless Youth Awareness Month, Bridge has put together a multimedia campaign that, is kind of out of home and on TV and radio. And the big message behind this campaign is that youth who are experiencing homelessness, identify in so many different ways. Maybe they identify as a musician or a dancer or a sports captain or a class president. This is just one small aspect of who, our youth may be and who they are, and an aspect that should not otherwise define them. And when we think about how we can connect with youth, another big part of that is creating that safe space so youth can access resources. And I know in previously discussing with the two of you about how important that has been in both, Courtney, on your floor in your particular program, and Rachel really throughout, all of our programs, where that's how those connections are made and that access to resources starts. But how do you actually do that? And, we talk about safe space, but what does that actually mean?
So when I think about a safe space, I think about allowing youth to step into a place where they can be their most authentic selves, where they're sitting with a provider who is going to listen and be judge-free, where they feel they're being included on their floor, where they feel safe providing feedback to providers, whether that be positive or negative, because they haven't always been able to do that in a space where it was allowed. A lot of youth are nervous to share any complaints or negative experiences due to histories of abuse. I think what's really important is building that relationship first and connecting with the youth on the floor. So when I first meet with youth, I really just try to get to know them before kind of diving into, anything clinical. I just try to get to know who they are as people, and hope that they feel comfortable with me to open up eventually.
Yeah, I mean, I think the relationship piece is probably one of the most important pieces of creating a safe space, or of what a safe place looks like, is just being there with the youth as your most authentic self, and allowing them to realize that it's safe to be their most authentic self in this space. They are not at risk of harm or ridicule or embarrassment by being themselves, and oftentimes, like, this is not something that they've experienced anywhere else before. So I think another part of that is, like, us as providers being aware that they might not trust us now, they might not trust us ever, but, like, continuing to come back and show that follow through of, like, we're going to be here. So I would say that that's a huge part of creating a safe space. Yeah.
And, when we think about what, the building that relationship, and we think about, accessing programs and services, the other big piece that I've heard from both of you, but also members of the Bridge team, is always having that trauma-informed approach. And in fact, that's so important that was in the name of today's session. So, I mean, first, let's start with the basics. Rachel, could you define trauma-informed care from, I'll say a pretty layman's please for me, terms of what that actually means, and then maybe both of you talk a little bit more about what that actually looks like within programs and interactions with youth.
Yes, absolutely. So trauma-informed care is something that's, like, widely thrown around, I would say, in the, like, clinical community or in helping professions, but, like, what does it actually mean? What does it look like? I would say that the way that I think about it is approaching each and every person that you're providing treatment for, or meeting with, or checking in with, just approaching them with the underlying belief that they may have experienced trauma, whether that's, they witnessed domestic violence, or they were present for a natural disaster. Trauma can take the form of, literally anything could be traumatic to somebody. And so I think, like, having that mindset of, like, this person in front of me, I don't know what they've been through, but regardless of what it is, it might have traumatized them. And as a result, they might be more sensitive to certain triggers. I might want to be careful about what language I use around them. I need to be especially present in that moment to be paying attention to body language and nonverbal cues. Like, is this person, like, shrinking into themselves when I use a certain word? Or how can I better point out, like, what they might be experiencing in the moment to let them know that I'm not going to further traumatize them. I think another thing that can be traumatizing to people, or another way that we can think about trauma, is, like, racial trauma, or the trauma of living a life as, like, an LGBTQ individual. Just the day-to-day life of being a homeless individual. Those are things that can compound trauma and make somebody even more sensitive and susceptible to certain triggers or things in the community that might make their life harder. And so by being trauma informed, we're keeping that in mind as just, like, our underlying perspective of, like, even if this person doesn't have any history of trauma in front of us, we're still going to approach them with, like, really gentle care until we know what they're able to handle in the moment, and what their threshold is for getting through this conversation.
I think when I think about trauma-informed care and how I practice it, I really like to think about giving youth as much agency and choice as possible. I have a client on this floor we have community dinners in the emergency residence every week on Wednesday nights. And each week each youth gets to choose a different theme for dinner. And when it was this youth's turn to choose what they wanted for dinner, he said, I don't care. And I said, you can have whatever you want for community dinner. This is your week. This is your theme. And he said, I've never had the ability to choose anything like this before in my life. And so when I tried to, kind of feel that out a little bit more, he couldn't give me an answer on what he would want to eat. He's like, I'll eat anything. That's what I've had to do my whole life. So when I practice trauma-informed care, I try to remember that peace in mind always, and give them as much choice and agency as possible. If they don't want to meet with me today, that's okay. They know that they have to meet with me once a week, and that can look like whatever they want it to look like. And I always try to keep that in mind moving forward. I also think I try to think about like redefining success for them and what that means. So for someone, trauma-informed care, or for someone, a goal might be to get out of bed that day, and that is a successful day for someone with a history of trauma. Whereas for someone else, that might not be enough for them, and they need to attend 3 groups on the second floor, and go to work that day, and that would be enough. But I try to remember and remind my staff, well, not my staff, but staff on the floor, to look at success in a different light.
Definitely. I mean, I think like redefining those successes and then also pointing them out to the youth, like that strengths-based capacity to like, hey, you got up today, you went to a group today, like you had breakfast, like you are killing it, you are doing a great job, just like really building them up is also, it's something that like we don't want to assume that they've ever had that before. And so like, I don't know, I think it's a big part of how trauma-informed care looks in practice is taking those strengths and pointing them out to the youth and pointing them out to their peers and being like, look how awesome you guys are, just for being yourselves.
In interactions with youth and these conversations, and Courtney, I really liked that example because I think it's super helpful to see what that actually looks like on a day-to-day basis. But what are the biggest roadblocks you see, or the biggest barriers that any youth might have toward, taking those next steps, or toward taking that accomplishment resulting from potentially past trauma that they might have had?
That's a good question.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead, Courtney.
I'm thinking of one example in terms of services or lack thereof resources. Another example I can think of is when I asked a youth what his goals were for the ER, because we come up with the service plan, and each youth comes up with a couple of goals that they want to work on while they're in their 6 months here. He couldn't really come up with anything, and I know he has goals, he just didn't want to share them. And eventually he said to me, why would I tell you you're just going to leave too? And I asked, what are you referring to? What are you talking about? And he's like, I've been in programs my whole life, and basically every provider I've spoken to has left. And so just this difficulty around trusting providers and asking for help for people who they don't know if they will have them long-term, and just being able to be trusting of anyone really due to their trauma, I think is really difficult. And that's a huge roadblock for a lot of the youth here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. Like definitely pointing out, the fact that those trusting relationships are not something that they've had access to before, and that becomes a roadblock for us trying to build these trusting relationships. It's like, oh no, I know you've been shot down over and over and over again throughout your life, but I'm actually here to help, and so having to like really show up and give that follow through, it would be a roadblock for us as staff, but then for the youth even more so, of like, then they have to put this trust in somebody else. And I also, as you were talking, Courtney, I was thinking about like just how many of our young people on the 3rd floor, but throughout Bridge in general, just don't believe that they even deserve the resources or the care or support, so that like when you were talking about the example of the youth who didn't know what to choose for dinner, it's like, well, why would I choose? Like, why me? Like, I don't, it's not about what I want, but it really is. And so like, that's another roadblock I think that the youth experience is like, they don't even know that they deserve success.
It's kind of hard to follow up from that last sentiment and statement, but I think it's a really important one. And, we did get a question in the chat that I'm going to bring up now, but how does Bridge ensure that there's continuity across staff and how they provide and create this safe space, and how does Bridge provide resources and support staff into being trauma informed and making sure that there's more consistency across programs?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a really big part of why my role exists. So the clinical supervisor role was created to try to include more continuity of care across programs. So that's including trainings and coaching and like really just oversight of all of our programs to make sure that, somebody on the day program is not getting more trauma informed care than somebody in the counseling department or in the emergency residence. And, it is definitely a challenge, but I think that like the biggest thing that staff are able to do for one another is communicate, so us as staff communicating with one another and being open to feedback, approaching the work with humility and like a willingness to learn every day is like really the way that we do that continuity of care and make sure that it happens. Yeah, I think it is definitely a challenge, but it's something that we are really committed to. Another thing I would just want to touch on here at Bridge that we are unique in is that we have tons of in-service training opportunities. So we have a full online learning system that is piloted by one of our supervisory staff here, and staff are able to like use the online learning system as they orient, but then also throughout their time working for Bridge, they can continue to go back on those trainings, refresh themselves on, trauma-informed care, but other types of care and other things that we practice here. And then additionally, we do weekly consultations, and which programs can kind of do cross consultations and talk about, like we're both working with the same young person. How can we all make sure that we're providing the same care and the same quality of care?
I think too, something I'm trying to be better at, and something I try to do is before a client moves either into my program or moves out of my program, I try to, like Rachel was just saying, communicate with the next group of people that youth will be with. Or for example, if a youth is in the hospital or in an outpatient program, I try to get releases and communicate with other natural supports or more formal supports in their life so that I can see what safety plans or service plans were in place and continue to use the same language that worked for them.
That's great. Thank you both. We have about just a few minutes left, so I want to open it up to anyone else. If there are any more questions out there, to either put in the chat or raise your hand, and want to make sure you have that opportunity to do that. And if we don't have any questions, I will ask Courtney and Rachel to share two last things. One being, what is the one thing that you would like people to know during National Homeless Youth Awareness Month about youth experiencing homelessness? And is there a brief, happy moment or story of success that you could share? So last call for questions on that. And if, of course, if something comes up, we could still bring up a question. But Rachel and Courtney, if there's one thing that you would hope people would know, and then one moment or reflection of success.
Yeah, I think like I would just want everyone to know just how incredibly strong and resilient these young people are. Like, they have so much to offer. I don't think that they give themselves enough credit, but I know that the world does not give these youth enough credit. Like, these young people are just so incredible. And every day I feel honored to walk into this building and get to interact with these young people because of just how amazing they are. And that would just be what I would want people to know. And then, to piggyback off of that with the success, I'm thinking specifically of this young person who I've been working with for the past several months or so, and has just really overcome a lot of hurdles in regards to his depression and PTSD. So, I mean, clinically, this is something that I've been working with him as a therapist, but also just to try to navigate all the resources. And he was just accepted into one of our longer term residential programs. And I'm just so excited for him, because this is something I never, I don't think he could have seen this for himself a month ago or 2 months ago. And so it's just been really exciting to see his joy and his excitement about that next step, and just his recognition of the success that he's achieved.
I want to kind of piggyback off of what Rachel was saying in terms of who these young people are. I mean, I am, and I know it sounds cheesy, but I'm really inspired by the youth I work with every day. Their resilience is unlike anything I've ever seen before, and they've been through so much, but they come with such a unique perspective and positive attitude, and they still find ways to support one another despite everything that they've gone through, which is really incredible. I mean, I would just continue to say that they are so deserving of so much, and I wish that they would see how deserving they are. But I just think that that's something that we have to continue to remind them. In terms of success story, my favorite story was when the emergency residence first opened. It was like the first, I think it was like at the end of the first month, and it was hard to get all the youth to get engaged with one another. It was kind of awkward, and community dinners, no one really talked to each other. And then one day someone brought Uno and asked if anyone wanted to play Uno, and the whole floor played Uno together. And I remember texting Rachel, and I was like, come down right now. Like, they're all playing Uno. And it was just a really awesome thing to see everyone start to connect with each other and feel safe to be themselves. And I think that's a success in itself.
Thank you both. I think that was great. One thing that I've talked to a few of our youth who have gone through some of our other housing programs is, yes, they had great things to say about the staff, but they also felt like they had that community connection with other youth who had been through similar situations that they might have been, or at least might understand where they're coming from. And when you might be out in school and you're trying your hardest to maybe hide the fact that you are experiencing homelessness, and you feel that you might be, surrounded by people that you're not really sharing everything with, but yet when you're in a community of youth who have maybe similar experiences, you're able to have conversations with peers that you might not otherwise have. And I think that sense of community is really important. Thank you both for being here today. I am really grateful that you were able to take the time and to share a little bit more about what you do. Certainly trauma-informed care, but youth who might be experiencing homelessness, particularly during National Homeless Youth Awareness Month, which is this November. But again, this youth don't experience homelessness just 1 month out of the year. And I think it's really important that while we might have these conversations now, that we also end with that reminder, right? This is not just 30 days. This is 365 days. So I hope everyone who was able to join us today is able to keep that in mind, that to learn something, to keep it with you, and to think about how you might be able to learn a little bit more and help. So thank you everyone for being here today. We really appreciate it. And again, the recording will be up on Bridge's homepage probably next week. Thank you all.